In the summer of 1976, Tangshan in China was a city of iron and coal. Tucked into the flatlands of Hebei province, just a short journey east of Beijing, it was not a glamorous place. It was not a city of shining monuments or great boulevards. Tangshan's pride lay underground, in the coal seams that ran like black veins through the earth, and in the factories that turned that coal into steel, the very lifeblood of China's modernization. Over 1 million people called Tangshan home. They were miners and machinists, steel workers and railwaymen. Families of 4 or 5 crowded into a single room in the new apartment blocks. Others lived in old-style hutongs, narrow alleys where neighbours cooked over coal stoves and children played between hanging laundry. The city was hot and loud, full of dust and smoke, the hiss of steam, the thunder of furnaces. It was not beautiful, but it was alive. To the party, Tangshan was a model of industry, proof that Mao's revolution could forge modern strength out of the sweat of ordinary men and women. July was stifling. Heat pressed down on the city day and night. The air tasted of coal smoke and iron filings. At night, families pushed their windows open to invite in any whisper of breeze, though it carried with it the sour smell of the factories. People spoke of small oddities, the wells bubbling strangely, the animals restless, horses sweating in their stalls, dogs howling without reason. Some said they had seen strange lights on the horizon, bands of colour shimmering like ghosts. But few took much notice. China in 1976 was a place of harder concerns. Food shortages, political campaigns, endless quotas. Anxieties about wells or dogs paled beside the need to survive another shift at the mine or another inspection by the party cadres. Let us pause and walk the city together in those final hours of peace. In the steelworks, the night shift, breaks for noodles, the workers' faces shining with sweat, blackened by coal dust. They joke, tired but proud of their labour, rolling their shoulders before returning to the blast furnaces. In a crowded hospital ward, a nurse bends over her notes, her lamp throwing a cone of light across the floor. Children cough in the darkness. A man with a broken leg turns in his bed, sighing in pain. She thinks of her own children waiting at home. Along the narrow alleys, men play cards by candlelight, their wives chatting softly nearby. A transistor radio hums with revolutionary music, faint, tinny, but just enough to cut through the summer night. And in the apartments, the city sleeps. Parents, children, grandparents, some sprawled on mats to escape the heat, some curled tightly together on low beds. The windows are open, the curtains stirring in the faintest wind. Breathing slows, dreams drift. The city rests, completely unaware that its every breath is numbered. Of course, Tangshan's story cannot be told without the wider shadow of China in 1976. The Cultural Revolution had shaken the country for a decade. Political campaigns had torn through schools, villages and factories. Neighbours accused neighbours. Families lived in fear of a knock at the door. Though the chaos had begun to subside, the scars remained. Mao Zedong himself was nearing the end of his life. Old, frail and sick, he clung to power, but his final days were counted. The nation waited, uncertain what would follow. In such a climate, truth was a fragile thing. Information was tightly controlled. Disasters could not exist, not if they risked weakening the image of the party, the unity of the people. Tangshan, this hard-working industrial city, was supposed to stand as proof of China's progress. The idea that such a place could fall, that an entire modern city could vanish in an instant, was unthinkable. And yet the ground beneath Tangshan was shifting. The 27th of July slid into the 28th. It was just after 3 in the morning. The factories had dimmed their lights, the trains slowed. Only a handful of workers remained awake, labouring in the endless cycle of production. The rest of Tangshan surrendered to sleep. A mother lulled her infant with a fan made from folded newspaper. A boy whispered stories to his younger sister until she drifted off. A man, exhausted from the mine, collapsed on his cot without even removing his boots. The city's heartbeat slowed. The cicadas droned outside. The faintest of winds rustled across the plains. All seemed calm. All seemed safe as the city slept. However, beneath Tangshan, ancient faults had been stirring for centuries. The plain looked stable, calm, harmless to the eye. But the earth's crust here was restless, stitched with fractures invisible to those who mined its coal or laid its railway tracks. Deep below, immense pressures had been building, layer upon layer, year upon year, until that night when the silence could hold no longer. It began with the animals. In the village outskirts, dogs rose and began to howl. Horses stamped and strained against their ropes, eyes wide in terror. Chickens clucked and battered their wings inside their coops, as though trying to escape. Cats bolted into the fields. A man lying awake with indigestion swore he felt his bed shift ever so slightly, as though nudged by some unseen hand. He frowned, held his breath, but then stillness. He shook his head, thinking himself foolish. In another quarter of the city, a nurse finishing her night rounds thought she heard the walls creak. A faint pop, like plaster cracking. She turned toward the sound, hesitated, then carried on with her notes. What was one sound in a building already old? And in the coal mines, deep beneath the city, workers reported hearing an unnatural groan in the rock around them. The sound echoed in the shafts, so low it felt more like a vibration in the bones than noise in the ears. They looked at one another uneasily, then bent back to their work. No warning sirens sounded, no alarms were raised. The city lay still, and the clock ticked toward disaster. At 3:41 a.m., the world above was tranquil. A boy of 12 shifted in his bed, rolling over to escape the sticky summer heat. He murmured in his sleep, dreaming of the coal trains he had seen that afternoon. A steelworker lit a cigarette on his balcony, leaning against the rail to watch the smoke rise into the heavy night. He thought of his wife inside and of their unborn child, and smiled to himself. In a ward of Tangshan Hospital, a woman in labour clutched her belly, groaning. The nurse leaned close, encouraging her, wiping the sweat from her brow. Ordinary seconds, ordinary lives. And then, without warning, the earth broke. At 3:42 a.m., Tangshan was struck by one of the most violent earthquakes in modern history. It began with a roar, deep and low, rolling through the ground like thunder. In an instant, the stillness of the night turned to chaos. Floors buckled, walls cracked and split. Entire buildings began to sway. People woke to terror. They tried to sit up in their beds, only to be flung sideways as ceilings collapsed and windows shattered. Some never woke at all, their last breath taken as the weight of brick and concrete crushed them before they could cry out. The steelworker on the balcony saw his building twist. The rail beneath his hands buckled, the cigarette falling from his lips. He stumbled back inside, calling for his wife, but the apartment was already folding in on itself. In the hospital ward, the woman in labour screamed, not from childbirth now, but from fear, as the walls crumbled around her. Nurses tried to shield the patients, but the ceiling gave way, burying beds, breaking bodies. In the mines, the groaning rock split apart. Shafts collapsed, support beams snapped like twigs. Hundreds of men were entombed in darkness, their cries echoing through tunnels that filled with choking dust. Above ground, the city itself convulsed. Streets cracked open, wide fissures splitting the asphalt. Railway lines twisted like ribbon. Pipelines burst, geysers of steam and water hissing into the dust. Power cables whipped and sparked, setting fires amid the ruins. The violence lasted just 15 seconds. 15 seconds long enough to destroy a city. When the shaking stopped, silence followed. Not peace, never peace, but the hollow quiet of shock. Dust billowed into the air, so thick that dawn was blotted out. People staggered into the streets, covered in grey powder, eyes wild with confusion. All around them lay wreckage, apartment blocks flattened to rubble, factories reduced to heaps of steel, entire neighbourhoods erased. And then came the sound that survivors would never forget. The cries. From beneath the ruins, voices rose. Mothers calling for their children, children sobbing for their parents, men shouting for help, their words muffled by tons of stone. Screams carried across the broken city, a chorus of agony and desperation. Those who still stood stumbled forward blindly, some clawing at the rubble with bleeding hands, others frozen in disbelief, unable to move. The silence of death, broken by the clamour of the living. Here and there, miracles. A boy crawled from the wreckage of his family home, his clothes torn, his face streaked with blood. He turned back and screamed for his parents, but the house was gone, a mound of crushed stone. A nurse staggered out of the collapsed hospital, one arm broken, her uniform ripped and grey with dust. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing, then rose again, stumbling back toward the ruins, desperate to pull anyone free. A coal miner, trapped beneath a beam, used his helmet to hammer at the debris until his knuckles were raw. Hours later, rescuers would find him alive, barely. But his comrades silenced forever in the tunnels, everywhere in Tangshan. Such moments repeated. Desperation, courage, and despair intertwined in the ruins. The quake had struck at the worst possible time, the dead of night. Nearly everyone was indoors, asleep, vulnerable. Out of a population of more than 1 million, hundreds of thousands were crushed in their beds. 9 out of every 10 buildings in the city were destroyed. Factories, schools, hospitals, entire blocks flattened. The great ironworks, pride of Tangshan, collapsed in on themselves like children's toys. The death toll in that first morning was unimaginable. Officially, later estimates would speak of 240,000 dead. But survivors, historians, and foreign observers believed the real figure far higher, perhaps 500,000 or more. In 15 seconds, Tangshan had become a graveyard. As if the first quake had not been enough, the earth struck again. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, barely 12 hours later, an aftershock measuring 7.1 rolled through the ruins. Walls that still stood toppled. Survivors, already trapped, were buried once more. Those who had crawled free screamed as dust rose again, choking their lungs. The people of Tangshan now feared the very ground beneath their feet. Every tremor, every vibration of passing trucks in the distance sent them scrambling in panic. They huddled in open fields, in parks, on bare patches of earth, terrified to re-enter any building. The city had not just been destroyed, it had been made uninhabitable. And then came the cruelest truth of all. No help arrived. Communications were down. Roads were shattered. Rail lines twisted beyond use. For hours, then days, Tangshan was cut off from the outside world. Beijing, only 150 kilometers away, knew something terrible had happened. But in the political climate of 1976, information moved slowly and cautiously. Local officials sent only partial reports, afraid of blame, afraid of punishment. The scale of the disaster was hidden even from those who might have helped. For the people of Tangshan, there would be no quick rescue. They were left to claw at the rubble with bare hands, to tear wood and brick apart with bleeding fingers, to dig for their loved ones, even as aftershocks threatened to bury them alive. When night fell on 28th July, Tangshan was a city of shadows. Fires burned across the ruins. The stench of smoke, dust and blood hung heavy. Survivors huddled together in the dark, listening to the moans of the trapped, fading into silence one by one. Some lit candles and placed them on the rubble, small flickers of light in a sea of darkness. Others sat in stunned silence, rocking back and forth, unable to speak. Children whimpered in the arms of parents who had nothing left to give. The earth, it seemed, had turned against them. Morning broke again on Tangshan. The sun rose over a city that no longer resembled itself. Streets erased, landmarks gone, buildings reduced to heaps of dust and twisted iron. In the light of day, the scale of the destruction could be seen for the first time. Whole neighbourhoods flattened. Factories that once echoed with the thunder of machines now lay silent, their chimneys broken, their walls in ruin. The survivors were still there, dust-streaked, dazed, many half-naked after crawling out from the wreckage. They stumbled among the ruins like ghosts, searching for water, for food, for loved ones. Some carried children on their backs, others clutched meagre bundles of possessions salvaged from the rubble. Most had nothing. Without outside help, rescue was a matter of bare hands and willpower. Families dug for their relatives with sticks and shards of broken brick. Men lifted beams with their shoulders until their muscles tore. Women clawed at stone until their fingernails broke. In some cases they succeeded, pulling a child, a brother, a mother, alive but broken, from the ruins. In others they uncovered only silence. Doctors who had survived set up makeshift clinics in fields and courtyards, bandaging wounds with strips of cloth torn from their own shirts. Medical care was crude and desperate. Herbs from nearby fields became medicine when nothing else was available. People shared what little food they had. Steamed buns pulled from collapsed kitchens, dried noodles scavenged from broken cupboards. Water came from wells, though many were contaminated. Still they drank, because thirst was stronger than fear. Amid the dust and death, the instinct to endure burned on. It took days before organised help reached the city. When the first convoys of the People's Liberation Army finally arrived, they found a place unrecognisable. Soldiers stared in stunned silence at the flattened city, their boots crunching over debris that had once been streets. The People's Liberation Army fanned out, digging survivors from ruins, distributing what supplies they could carry. Their trucks brought water, food, tents, but the numbers were far too few. For every life saved, dozens more lay buried beyond reach, and yet their presence mattered. Survivors remembered the moment soldiers lifted them from the rubble, the rough but steady hands pulling them back into light. Children remembered being wrapped in army coats, lifted onto lorries bound for field hospitals hastily erected outside the city. The army worked tirelessly, but the scope was beyond comprehension. Tangshan was not a disaster site. It was a disaster world. Beyond the ruins, another battle was taking place, the battle over truth. In Beijing, officials wrestled with the implications of what had happened. Mao Zedong was still alive, though fading. The Cultural Revolution still cast its long, suffocating shadow. Admitting the full scale of the disaster risked shaking faith in the party at a time when its grip on the nation was fragile. And so the disaster was cloaked in silence. Foreign journalists were kept away. Reports were tightly censored. Casualty figures were minimised, revised, buried under official language. For the survivors, there would be no open mourning, no headlines telling their story, no global outcry. Their suffering remained hidden behind a wall of secrecy. Even within China, families in other provinces heard little or nothing at all. Relatives in Beijing waited weeks before learning whether their loved ones in Tangshan lived or died. It was as if Tangshan had been swallowed by the earth, not just physically, but politically, erased from the record even as its people clawed at the soil for breath. And yet, amid that silence, the human will to survive burned on. There were stories of miraculous endurance, people found alive after days trapped beneath the rubble, a miner pinned beneath beams for nearly a week, surviving by licking condensation from stones. A grandmother discovered beneath a collapsed courtyard, shielding her grandchild with her own body, the child still breathing, the woman cold. Communities formed from nothing. Neighbours who had never spoken before now shared food, shared grief, shared labour, fields outside the city filled with makeshift tents, cloth stretched over poles, salvaged sheets, anything that could offer shade in the baking summer heat. Nights were the hardest. Survivors huddled together in the dark, terrified of aftershocks, haunted by the voices of the dead still echoing in their ears. Some prayed. Others sat in silence, staring at the ground, as if the earth itself had become their enemy. 6 weeks after the quake, Mao Zedong died. For many in China, it seemed like a cosmic connection. The death of the chairman and the death of Tangshan entwined, symbols of an era ending. Some whispered that the earthquake had been an omen, the earth itself rising in fury to mark the close of Mao's rule. In truth, the two were not linked, but in the minds of millions, they became inseparable. Tangshan's destruction was seen as the final, terrible punctuation to a generation of upheaval. And in the weeks after Mao's death, the silence around Tangshan deepened. The new leadership looked forward, not back. Official casualty numbers were frozen. Memorials were muted. The survivors' grief remained largely private, locked inside their own memories. Rebuilding Tangshan took years. New apartment blocks rose where old ones had fallen. Factories were rebuilt, railways restored, the furnaces lit again. By the 1980s, Tangshan was once more an industrial hub, living proof of China's determination to rise from ruin. But for the survivors, the scars never healed. Children grew up without parents. Parents buried children. Husbands and wives rebuilt their lives in silence, their memories too painful to voice. Entire families had been erased, names crossed out from family registers, lines of ancestry cut short. Even decades later, survivors would flinch at the sound of a rumbling lorry, mistaking it for the growl of the earth. Some never slept soundly again. And the numbers remained contested. Officially, 242,000 dead. But in Tangshan itself, in whispers, in private grief, people spoke of many more, perhaps 500,000. A wound so vast that even numbers could not contain it. Today, Tangshan is rebuilt, modern, thriving again. But beneath its streets lies the memory of that night in 1976. Beneath its foundations lie the bones of thousands who never rose from their beds. The earthquake remains one of the deadliest natural disasters in human history, not just for its sheer violence, but for the silence that followed. A silence that denied the world the truth of what had happened, that forced survivors to carry their grief alone. To walk the streets of Tangshan today is to walk over ghosts. Invisible, unmarked, but present, in every breath of dust, every stone in the rebuilt walls. The deadliest earthquake of the 20th century, and for many years, the least spoken of. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the creative fire burning.